If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to Mindshock. This is your host, Bruce McGuire. Today I'm talking about real fence sitters because there seem to be very, very few. And this is one of the reasons the Mindshock podcast exists, because I pretty much call it how I see it. I will point out deficiencies or issues with both sides of everything, and I don't pretend to know what is true or untrue. There seem to be a lot of highly egotistical, easily triggered, childish personalities out there on all topics and all podcasts, where they pretend to know whether something is true or not, and they just grovel at these altars of scientism and all these things. Mindshock is for truth, promoting logic and reason as the methodology to truth, instead of just guessing or taking on blind faith the word of corrupt profiteers, as if history has no lessons to teach. So I'll just be discussing fence sitting and real fence sitters for this podcast. As always, if you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. If you like the podcast, hit the like button, share it across social media platforms. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings, insults of any kind, leave them in the comment section. You can check us out on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic requests, and depending on your tier, you can also be a guest on the podcast. So what is a fence sitter? So a fence sitter is someone who doesn't automatically or desperately cling to a particular side of anything, of any issue, whether Democrat, Republican, moon landing being a hoax or not, the earth being globe or flat, because condemnation without investigation is, of course, the height of ignorance, and you have a lot of people pretending to be scientific when they're just scientismic. Scientism is, of course, the cult of authority worship, pretending that dogmatic, subjective opinions and interpretations using fallible human technology and fallible human theories are somehow settled science. And when this is exposed, this is one of the most triggering things. When I expose scientism masquerading as science, there's more hate and blowback than pretty much any other topic, because of course the subconscious of the triggered identify that what I'm saying is true regarding scientism versus science. These are easily defined definitions. Now, I'm not pretending to know what the truth is about any particular subject, whether it's globe earth, flat earth, vaccines, coronavirus. I'm not as silly to pretend that there's enough information to know, or pretend that it can be known for sure with the limited amount of information, with the amount of fraud out there, with the amount of deception and corrupt profiteers and corrupt institutions that run everything, the powers that be, so to speak. To pretend to know one way or another for sure that's as silly as you can get. And that's what's so mind-shocking about Mindshock. We don't fall for any of these logical fallacies or pretend something can be known for sure when it can't. The motto, of course, is here. The only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. And of course, we're not 100% sure about that either. We can know empirically verifiable definitions or anything that is an objective observation and can be clearly empirically verified. Anything that does not defer to faith, we can know more or less, but that's not a lot in the grand scheme of things. That's really not a lot. So the whole fence-sitting thing, Joe Rogan falsely advertised himself as a fence-sitter on his podcast, of course, and on certain topics he kind of sort of is, but most of the time he's very dogmatic. He's very hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult of authority worship and scientism, which he proves many, many times over. His Dunning-Kruger quite off the charts, his ego off the chart. He does a lot of projecting. If you haven't checked out my logical analysis on the Joe Rogan podcast itself and on his discussions with Eddie Bravo, I do point-by-point breakdowns examining Joe Rogan's logic or lack thereof and his argumentation. But there are real fence sitters out there, particularly those who believe in empiricism, where whatever you can verify yourself and you don't have to take on blind faith as gospel truth, especially by the words of proven corrupt profiteers and proven liars, that you can verify and believe, but everything else you wouldn't really know one way or the other, and that's really what it comes down to. The hubris of humans. People just are that silly to think that humans in positions of authority can't be mistaken. It's just really that simple. It's that simple. What is the coronavirus? Is the coronavirus real? Do vaccines work? How would you know one way or another, and how much information is required to definitively know one way or another? Now, obviously, I am not advocating you believe one thing or another. You can consider something to be true without believing in it. Aristotle considered that the mark of an educated mind. However, in most of these cases, it's really impossible to know for sure. Because there's multiple theories, there's usually evidence supporting different theories, conflicting theories. If you don't appeal to authority all the time, there's authorities on both sides of every issue, and that's something, silly coincidence theorists pretend isn't true. They pretend, like, for example, those doubting man-made climate change or considerable, impactful man-made climate change being real. There's some of the smartest people in the world have written books on this and just point out, it's basic common sense, of course. In real science and not scientism, you need to be able to verify controls. So asking people to believe in corrupt profiteers lining their pockets, like these tax lobbyists, special interest groups, to just take on faith what they say, that's just silly. That's as anti-science as you can get. So real science, of course, is never settled. Scientism, on the other hand, is dogmatic and always settled. The religion of scientism, of course, being one of the threats to humanity, but scientism is probably the leading religion of the world. The cult of authority and state worship, where people just grovel at these altars, like the CDC or WHO, NASA. They treat these institutions as churches, and they're priests advocating some kind of divine truths. So obviously, if we're going to be actually scientific and default to the scientific method, we need to be able to verify controls. But experts are the leads of all these so-called conspiracies with the coincidence theorists who can't think critically. They deem conspiracy theory having something to do with invalidity, as if it's related anyway. Conspiracy is just that, humans are greedy, humans are corrupt. They don't always act alone in their greed and corruption and nefarious plots. It's just that simple. There's some very, coincidence theorists are, of course, very, very naive about how they think that these corrupt profiteers wouldn't be corrupt profiteers. It's just, it's silliness to the nth degree. But even those leading the so-called anti-vax movement, anti-vax is just pro-science. You're just asking for actual evidence that adheres to the scientific method, not denying that vaccines work. Maybe they work, maybe they don't. But if they do work, you would need actual scientific evidence adhering to the scientific method with verifiable controls. If you don't have that, why would you believe? It's so silly. It's so silly. But these individuals that are writing these books, these are leading experts in virology, pathology, doctors that simply are skeptical of corrupt profiteers' claims that their $1 trillion golden goose is effective or safe, which obviously it's not either. Now, it might still work in a small percentage of cases, but again, you'd have to verify controls. And that's something that those promoting scientism and hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult of state and authority worship, they never do that. They run for the hills as soon as adherence to the scientific method is demanded, actual scientific proof presented with verifiable controls. So as far as fence sitting goes, it doesn't necessarily mean you believe or disbelieve. Now, I believe I am a true fence sitter, in which case I don't pretend to know what is true or untrue. I don't really have a position other than advocating for logic and reason. I'm not a fence sitter when it comes to logic, reason, scientific method. I'm a big fan. I'm on the side of the scientific method, logic, and reason because I believe it is valid. And studying logical fallacies is the quickest way to know whether or not your position or argumentation is logical, aka valid, or if it's just propaganda and faith-based presuppositions peddled by corrupt profiteers and the brainwashing media that has indoctrinated the masses into the unthinking herd or lemmings running off that cliff. and they can just find solace and soothe their cognitive dissonance, ego, Dunning-Kruger with their appeal to popularity logic fallacy, and they find comfort in running with the herd because it feels safer. So calling out those that pretend to be fence sitters when they're not, like Joe Rogan and these other people that may or may not be shills. If you haven't checked out the Mindshock podcast, Government Shills, check it out. I go over David Icke, Alex Jones, Joe Rogan, these individuals that may or may not be shills, but they clearly do not appear to be fence sitters. Now, why are there so few fence sitters out there? I think that's also a result of indoctrination into the cult of state and authority worship, where people are so hopelessly brainwashed into the cult of authority worship and scientism, they go along and pretend that people in positions of power or certain established theories by fallible humans using fallible technology, and these fallible theories are not fallible. And it's silliness to the nth degree, and it's quite hilarious as well, but that seems to be the case. And corrupt profiteers, these rulers and slave masters. I mean, again, I advocate everybody read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, because some of these strategies to divide and conquer and controlled oppositions to keep these brainless masses arguing with each other instead of seeing the true enemies of liberty and truth, which are, of course, the corrupt profiteers that seek to enslave and seek power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, of course. And a lot of things the coincidence theorists fail to do also is just learn the lessons of history. It's really bizarre. Aldous Huxley has a famous quote: "The real lesson of history is that men do not learn from the lessons of history," which is very, very apt. No matter how many times these same strategies are employed, controlled opposition, Democrat versus Republican, or socialism, communism, the subjugation of individual liberty, no matter how many times, I mean, with gun grabs, whatever, I mean, these always come before these mass slaughters. And tyranny. It's really bizarre how coincidence theorists are so blind to just basic logic and reason. And I'm not even advocating to jump to the other side. It's just fence sitting seems to be a very logical, viable position because most things are very difficult to know for certain. That's why this podcast exists. That's why the motto of the podcast is, of course, the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. And when you come at it from that point of view, instead of all this hubris and ego and Dunning-Kruger, if you come from the position that the real truth is very difficult to know, I mean, that's a pretty enlightened, wise position, because you're not going to be falling for logical fallacies. You're not going to be digging these traps, because so often people just dig themselves deeper and deeper holes because they can't consider the possibility. They can't consider the possibility that they might be mistaken or wrong. Or that the corrupt profiteers whose propaganda and dogma they bought into, either from the idiot box or family members or indoctrination officers at indoctrination facilities known as schools, have instilled and brainwashed and indoctrinated them with this information, they can't consider that it might be inaccurate, incomplete, or just flat out wrong. Despite the fact that throughout history, whatever the majority of people believed the majority of the time turned out to be wrong. Why would this be any different? Of course, these lessons of hubris. Ancient Greek mythology has much to teach us, but hubris, of course, the pride cometh before the fall. It's so basic, and yet it seems like 99% of supposedly functioning adults walking around in their Dunning-Kruger stupor just can't understand or fail to realize it. Their egos got them on such strings that they just can't consider the possibility that they were hoodwinked. Doesn't make them stupid, although obviously in a lot of cases they also are. But a lot of it's just ignorance and hoodwinking. And of course, good-hearted people are very easy to hoodwink because they're not going to consider the worst in others because they're good-hearted. So there's a certain presupposition, faith-based presupposition, that these corrupt profiteers would never go to these lengths to be corrupt profiteers and enslave and exploit and steal. So yeah, there's definitely a dearth of fence sitters out there. I mean, even these fringe conspiracy theorists, these hardcore conspiracy theorists who do more than theorize, they advocate with certainty that all of this is either true or whatever, it's the same issue. It's the opposite end of the spectrum if they're not considering the possibility that they could be wrong. So true fence sitters seem to be a very, very rare breed. But I think that is usually the most logical position for most issues, because with limited information, it's very, very difficult to make definitive conclusions about anything, especially if one is not well versed in logic, logical fallacies, even basic human psychology to understand your own biases as you're examining issues. Of course, we have normalcy biases and all of these things due to indoctrination. And obviously, everybody's been indoctrinated. Even, if you were born to hardcore conspiracy theorists, you'd be indoctrinated into that. So everybody, to a certain extent, is very, very indoctrinated. To break through it, you have to study logic and reason and a certain amount of psychology. Otherwise, you'll just be one of these hopelessly hoodwinked masses, lemmings running off the cliff, completely oblivious to the extent of their suffering under Dunning-Kruger. The Dunning-Kruger effect, of course, when one is too incompetent to realize their own incompetence. Something that is a major, major issue, which is why I talk about it, because solving that problem would solve a whole lot of other problems. If you haven't checked out the podcast Assumed Competency, that's another issue, that people that are hopelessly indoctrinated, they just assume there's a certain competency because they're indoctrinated into the cult of authority worship. They assume that authorities have a certain level of competency that they do not. So these are the issues, and hopefully we'll see more and more fence sitters out there as people start to see this scientism masquerading as science exposed, and these corrupt profiteers exposed. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal, help us bring out more and more mind-shocking content for people to enjoy and learn from. If you like the podcast, hit the like button. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. Make sure your device allows those notifications to come through so you can get notified when Mindshock releases new podcast episodes. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. You can check us out on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcaster requests, as well as having your questions answered in priority order, and also the possibility of being a guest on the podcast. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.